The iron-rimmed wheels of the stagecoach ground to a halt against the hard-packed earth of Oakhaven, sending up a plume of pale, alkaline dust that settled over the wooden boardwalks like a shroud. Lynn stepped down from the carriage, her boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the dry ground. She was a woman of East Asian descent, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, practical knot at the nape of her neck, her posture rigidly upright despite the exhaustion that pulled at the corners of her eyes. She carried a single leather valise, its corners worn smooth by miles of relentless travel, and within it rested the entirety of her worldly possessions. The harsh afternoon sun beat down upon her shoulders, illuminating the subtle, fine embroidery on her collar, a remnant of a life that had been abruptly and cruelly stripped away. She stood in the centre of the thoroughfare, a solitary figure amidst the bustling, indifferent machinery of a settlement built on ambition and ruthless commerce. She had arrived with the promise of a position as an educated tutor and bookkeeper for a prominent family, an arrangement secured by a man who had demanded her life savings as a bond of good faith, only to vanish into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the territory before the coach had even crossed the county line. Oakhaven was a place that did not forgive vulnerability. The wooden facades of the buildings leaned against one another as if conspiring, their shadowed awnings hiding the judgmental gazes of men and women who viewed any outsider with deep, inherent suspicion. Lynn felt the weight of their stares, a collective, silent appraisal that found her lacking simply by virtue of her sudden destitution and her unfamiliar features. She walked toward the local mercantile, her steps measured, betraying none of the panic that fluttered like a trapped bird within her ribcage. She required a simple loaf of bread and perhaps a moment of shade to gather her scattered thoughts and formulate a plan of survival. She entered the store, the bell above the door announcing her presence with a sharp, intrusive jangle that caused the murmuring voices within to instantly cease. The proprietor of the mercantile was a man known to all as Silas Thorne, a figure who held the deeds to half the town and the debts of the other half. He stood behind the long, polished oak counter, his hands resting upon the brass fittings of a heavy ledger. He was a man of superficial respectability, dressed in a sharp wool suit that seemed entirely impractical for the desert heat, his smile a thin, calculated line that never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes. When Lynn approached the counter and quietly requested a loaf of bread, placing her last remaining copper coins upon the wood, Silas Thorne did not reach for the money. Instead, he looked at her with a mixture of disdain and predatory interest, his gaze sweeping over her dusty but finely made garments. He pushed the coins back toward her with the tip of his finger, the sound of the metal scraping against the wood loud in the sudden, tense silence of the room. He spoke in a voice that was smooth and oiled with false, polite concern, stating loudly enough for the gathered patrons to hear that he did not accept the meagre, insufficient funds of vagrants. He suggested, with a cruel twist of his lips, that a woman of her apparent status, arriving alone and without means, must surely be a grifter, an opportunist seeking to steal from the honest, hard-working citizens of Oakhaven. The accusation hung in the still air, heavy and suffocating. The townspeople who lingered among the barrels of flour and bolts of calico shifted uncomfortably, but none moved to her defense. They simply watched, complicit in their silence, as Silas Thorne systematically attempted to strip away her dignity. Lynn did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger, nor did she shrink away from the counter. She met Silas Thorne's gaze with a quiet, unwavering resilience, her spine stiffening. She calmly stated that she was no vagrant, that she had been defrauded, and that she merely wished to purchase sustenance with the legal tender she possessed. Her voice was precise, careful, and formal, the clipped syllables ringing with an education and a refinement that only seemed to anger the man further. He slammed his hand against the ledger, abandoning his veneer of politeness, and loudly accused her of attempting to pass counterfeit coin, demanding she leave his establishment before he summoned the local magistrate to have her locked in the jailhouse for theft and vagrancy. The injustice of the moment was a physical weight pressing down upon her, threatening to crack the composed shell she had so carefully maintained since the realization of her betrayal. Across the dusty expanse of the main street, seated upon a wooden bench in the deep shade of the feed store awning, Elias observed the unfolding scene. He was a man defined by the vast, silent spaces he inhabited, a solitary rancher who came to town only when absolute necessity dictated. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with the deep lines of past grief and unrelenting labor. 10 years prior, a devastating illness had swept through the territory, taking his wife and leaving him in a hollow, echoing world that he had subsequently walled off from the rest of humanity. He was known throughout the county as a just landowner, a man of few words and immovable principles, but he was also a ghost, a man who moved through the world without truly touching it. Yet, as he watched the crowd gather near the open door of the mercantile, listening to the raised, cruel voice of Silas Thorne and the quiet, steady responses of the stranded woman, a spark of long-dormant indignation flared within his chest. He recognized the tactics of Silas Thorne, having watched the man slowly strangle the life out of smaller homesteads with fraudulent loans and social intimidation. Elias stood up, his tall frame uncoiling with a slow, deliberate grace. He adjusted the brim of his worn Stetson, the shadow falling over his pale, assessing eyes. He did not act out of a sudden burst of romantic chivalry. He acted out of a fundamental, practical aversion to bullies and a deep-seated respect for the quiet dignity he witnessed in the stranger's posture. He stepped off the boardwalk, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he crossed the street, the sound of his spurs a soft, rhythmic warning that caused the crowd near the mercantile door to part instinctively. Elias entered the store, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the doorway and block out the harsh afternoon light. The oppressive atmosphere within the room shifted immediately. He walked directly to the counter, ignoring the murmuring townsfolk and the sudden nervous twitch in Silas Thorne's jaw. He looked down at the copper coins resting on the oak surface, then looked at Lynn. He saw the sheer exhaustion in her eyes, the minute trembling of her hands that she was trying so desperately to hide, and the profound, isolating vulnerability of her situation. He turned his attention to Silas Thorne, his expression completely blank, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried effortlessly to the back of the room. He stated, as a matter of absolute fact, that the coins were good and that the bread was to be wrapped. Silas Thorne attempted to sputter a protest, attempting to reassert his dominance by citing the woman's lack of references and her supposed vagrant status. Elias cut him off with a single, raised hand. He reached into the pocket of his heavy canvas coat and withdrew a silver dollar, dropping it onto the counter with a heavy, final thud. He announced to the room at large, but speaking directly to Silas Thorne, that the woman was no vagrant because she was currently employed by him. He stated that he had been in need of a competent bookkeeper and a manager for his household for quite some time, and that he was settling her immediate accounts as an advance on her wages. The offer was purely transactional, a practical intervention framed to preserve her pride and completely dismantle the banker's leverage. Lynn turned to look at the towering man beside her. The sudden, unexpected reprieve was a shock to her system, more jarring than the hostility she had faced moments before. The absolute certainty in his voice, the casual way he had placed himself between her and the town's malice, broke through the final, fragile barrier of her composure. A single, silent tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a clean path down her dust-streaked cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but a sudden, overwhelming release of the tension she had carried for hundreds of miles. She quickly lowered her head, deeply ashamed of this momentary loss of control, reaching with a trembling hand to brush the moisture away. Before she could touch her own face, a square of faded, meticulously clean white cotton appeared in her field of vision. Elias held it out to her, his large, calloused hand remarkably steady. It was a handkerchief he had carried in his breast pocket for 10 years, a remnant of his late wife's sewing, a piece of fabric he had held onto as a silent anchor to a past he could not change. He did not offer it with pity, but with a quiet, solemn understanding of the weight she was carrying. "Do not cry, miss," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her ears. "The dust here is thick enough without adding water to mud." He handed her the handkerchief, a small, profound gesture of transfer, offering her a piece of his own guarded history as a shield against the present. She took the cloth, her fingers brushing briefly against his rough skin. The fabric smelled faintly of lye soap and dried sage. She pressed it to her cheek, nodding once, a sharp, decisive movement that signalled the return of her formidable composure. She accepted his offer without hesitation, understanding the lifeline for what it was. She stated her readiness to depart immediately, her voice steady once more. Elias nodded, turning his back on the scowling proprietor and the silent audience. He picked up her heavy leather valise as if it weighed nothing at all and escorted her out of the mercantile, leaving Silas Thorne fuming in the shadows of his own thwarted malice. The journey to the ranch was a long, silent passage through a landscape of stark, unforgiving beauty. Elias drove the buckboard wagon with practiced ease, the two sturdy draft horses navigating the winding, rocky trail that led away from Oak Haven and into the high country. Lynn sat beside him on the wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the faded white handkerchief still clutched tightly in her fingers. She observed the shifting terrain, the transition from the dusty scrubland to the rolling foothills dotted with ancient twisted juniper trees and fragrant stands of ponderosa pine. The silence between them was not the awkward, heavy silence of strangers, but rather a vast, open space that neither felt the immediate need to fill with idle chatter. They were two solitary souls, both accustomed to carrying their burdens internally, cautiously evaluating the sudden proximity of another. Hours later, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the western mountains, casting long purple shadows across the valley floor, the ranch came into view. It was a sprawling expanse of grazing land, bordered by a clear, fast-running creek, but the homestead itself bore the undeniable marks of long-term neglect. The main house, a sturdy structure of native stone and thick timber, looked lonely and unkempt. The porch steps were sagging, the windows were clouded with years of dust, and the surrounding garden, once clearly a place of cultivated beauty, was now a chaotic tangle of dead vines and encroaching weeds. It was the physical manifestation of Elias's internal state, fundamentally strong, deeply rooted, but entirely devoid of life and warmth. Lynn stepped down from the wagon, her sharp eyes taking in the entirety of the disrepair. She did not express dismay or hesitation. Instead, a quiet, methodical energy seemed to settle over her. She saw not a ruin, but a complex problem waiting to be solved, a chaotic system requiring the application of order and diligent effort. Elias showed her to a small Spartan room near the back of the house, informing her briefly of the location of the well, the woodpile, and the pantry, before retreating to the barn to tend to the horses, leaving her to acclimate to her new surroundings. The arrangement began in earnest the following morning at first light. Lynn attacked the neglect of the household with a fierce, quiet competence. She bound her hair up securely, donned a heavy canvas apron she found in a forgotten trunk, and set to work. Over the next several weeks, the transformation was undeniable. The windows were scrubbed until they gleamed, allowing the golden morning light to pierce the gloom of the interior. The heavy, dust-laden rugs were beaten and aired. The aroma of baking bread and roasting meats replaced the stale, empty smell of the kitchen. She moved through the house with a purposeful grace, her actions precise and efficient. Elias observed this transformation with a growing, silent admiration. He would return from the far pastures at dusk, his body aching from the grueling labor of mending fences and tracking stray cattle, to find a hot meal waiting on the scrubbed wooden table, the lamps trimmed and burning brightly. He watched her hands, capable and strong, as she kneaded dough or expertly mended a tear in his heavy work shirts. Their interactions remained formal, centered entirely around the practicalities of the ranch, but the silence between them began to subtly shift in quality. It lost its wary edge, becoming a comfortable, shared quietude, a mutual acknowledgement of a job well done. It was in the evenings, after the physical labor of the day was concluded, that her true value to the operation became apparent. Elias had brought out a stack of leather-bound ledgers, dropping them onto the dining table with a heavy sigh, explaining that the ranch's finances had been a tangled mess for years, largely managed by proxy through Silas Thorne in town. Lynn opened the books, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers with the sharp, practiced gaze of a scholar. She spent hours by the light of a kerosene lamp, her pen scratching methodically across fresh sheets of paper as she cross-referenced receipts, tallied expenditures, and traced the convoluted paths of loans and interest payments. Her mind was a formidable engine of logic, and she quickly discovered that the chaos in the ledgers was not merely the result of neglect, but of deliberate, systematic obfuscation. She found discrepancies, inflated interest charges, phantom supply orders, and subtle alterations in the terms of the ranch's standing debts. She presented her findings to Elias one evening, laying out the papers in a neat, undeniable array. She spoke clearly and without hesitation, explaining exactly how Silas Thorne had been slowly siphoning the wealth of the ranch, using complex legal loopholes and fraudulent accounting to position himself to eventually seize the land entirely. Elias listened in absolute silence, his jaw tightening as the full extent of the betrayal was laid bare. He did not doubt her calculations for a single moment. He looked at the precise, elegant columns of numbers she had drawn, and then he looked at her face, illuminated by the warm, flickering light of the lamp. He saw the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, the absolute integrity of her work. In that moment, the fundamental nature of their relationship shifted. She was no longer merely a rescued outsider or a hired housekeeper. She was an indispensable partner in the defense of his domain. He nodded slowly, placing his large hand over the papers, and stated simply that they would need to prepare a countermeasure. Word of the sudden order and prosperity radiating from the solitary ranch eventually trickled down into Oakhaven, carried by passing riders and the occasional supply driver. The news reached the ears of Silas Thorne, who sat in his plush, velvet-lined office above the mercantile, his anger simmering into a cold, calculated panic. He had relied on the solitary rancher's grief-stricken apathy to slowly steal his empire out from under him. The introduction of a sharp-minded, educated outsider into the equation was a variable he had not anticipated and could not tolerate. He realized that if his fraudulent practices were exposed by this woman, his entire empire of debt and extortion would collapse, leaving him ruined and facing the harsh justice of the territory. Silas Thorne decided that the threat had to be neutralized quickly before the ledgers could be brought before a circuit judge. He ordered his carriage prepared and rode out to the ranch, accompanied by two of his most imposing, rough-hewn foremen, men who specialized in intimidation and the enforcement of his will. They arrived at the homestead on a sweltering afternoon, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a dry thunderstorm. Elias was away in the high pastures, leaving Lynn alone at the house. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression unreadable as the carriage halted in the dusty yard. Silas Thorne descended, his smile wide and utterly devoid of warmth. He approached the steps, removing his hat in a mockery of polite deference. He began to speak, his voice dripping with false concern, suggesting that it was highly improper for a woman of her standing to be living unchaperoned with a known recluse. He hinted heavily and maliciously that the town was talking, that her reputation was being irreparably damaged, and that she would be wise to abandon her current employment and return to town, where he might be persuaded to find her a more suitable, respectable position. Lynn saw straight through the veneer of social concern to the cowardice and desperation lurking beneath. She stood on the elevated porch, looking down at him with a gaze so cold and piercing that the banker momentarily faltered. She replied, her voice ringing with dry irony, that she found his sudden concern for her reputation stubbornly funny, considering he had been perfectly willing to see her jailed for vagrancy mere months prior. She stated unequivocally that she was employed by a man of honor, and that she had absolutely no intention of leaving the ranch or abandoning her meticulous review of the financial records. Silas Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of genuine malice. He dropped the pretense of politeness, gesturing to the heavy-set foreman standing by the carriage. He threatened to call in a fraudulent note he claimed to hold against the property, a note he insisted would render the ranch bankrupt by the end of the month. He warned her that accidents were common in the isolated foothills, that fires started easily in the dry grass, and that a woman alone was a fragile thing. The threat was a tangible, ugly presence in the heavy air. Lynn did not flinch. She simply turned her back on him, walked into the house, and closed the heavy oak door with a resounding final click, leaving him to rage in the dust. The tension broke 3 nights later under the cover of a moonless, suffocatingly hot night. The air was still, thick with the scent of dry pine needles and dust. Lynn awoke abruptly, her senses instantly alert. It was not a sound that woke her, but a smell, the sharp, acrid tang of wood smoke slipping through the cracks of her window frame. She threw off her blankets, rushing to the glass. In the distance, near the massive timber structure of the main barn where the winter feed and the most valuable draft horses were kept, a line of angry orange flame was rapidly crawling through the dry, knee-high grass, purposefully set and moving fast. The crucible moment had arrived. She did not scream or panic. Her mind, accustomed to organizing chaos into manageable columns, immediately prioritized the threats, the horses, the barn, the ledgers. She threw on her heavy boots and a wool shawl, sprinting down the hallway. She pounded on Elias's door, shouting a single sharp warning of fire before turning and running toward the dining room. She swept the stack of ledgers, the undeniable proof of the banker's crimes, into a heavy canvas sack, securing it tightly. Only then did she run out the back door and toward the growing inferno. The heat was an almost physical blow, the roar of the flames a deafening rush in the night air. Elias emerged moments later, half-dressed, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw the line of fire advancing on the barn and immediately grasped the sabotage. Together they fought the blaze. They did not need to issue commands. They moved in a synchronized, desperate rhythm. Lynn hauled heavy buckets of water from the trough, her muscles straining, dousing the walls of the barn to prevent the wood from catching, while Elias used heavy, soaked blankets to beat back the advancing line of fire in the grass. The smoke stung her eyes and choked her lungs, the intense heat singing the stray hairs that escaped her knot. She heard the panicked whinnying of the horses trapped inside the structure. Without waiting for instruction, she dropped her bucket, pulled her shawl over her mouth and nose, and plunged into the smoke-filled interior of the barn. The heat inside was oppressive, the air thick and dark. She moved blindly, relying on memory and touch, unlatching the heavy stall doors and slapping the terrified animals on their flanks, driving them out into the cool, open air of the night. She emerged from the barn coughing violently, her face streaked with black soot, just as the roof of a nearby storage shed collapsed in a shower of sparks. It took an hour of brutal, exhausting labor to finally kill the last of the flames. When it was over, the night was silent once more, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 exhausted figures standing amidst the blackened, smouldering earth. The barn had been saved. The horses were safe in the far paddock. Elias dropped his ruined, blackened blanket and walked slowly toward Lynn. She was leaning against the stone rim of the well, her chest heaving, her hands covered in soot and minor burns. He stopped in front of her, the massive silhouette of his frame blocking the faint starlight. He reached out, his movements incredibly gentle, and took her hands in his. He turned them over, examining the reddened, blistered skin of her palms with a deep, silent concern. It was the first instance of deliberate, caring physical contact between them since the day he had handed her the handkerchief. The rough calluses of his thumbs brushed lightly against her wrists. He looked up from her hands, his eyes meeting hers in the darkness, and the high fences he had built around his heart finally, irrevocably, collapsed. In the quiet aftermath of the destruction, amidst the smell of ash and survival, a profound vulnerability settled over them. Elias spoke, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the smoke. He confessed the depth of the grief that had paralyzed him for a decade, the suffocating guilt of surviving when his wife had not, the self-imposed exile that he had believed was his only remaining duty. He told her that the handkerchief he had given her was the last thing his wife had sewn, and that letting it go had felt like severing a mooring line, setting him adrift until he realized the line had actually been a noose, choking the life out of him. Lynn listened, the heat of his hands still holding hers. She felt the massive weight of his confession, the profound trust it represented. In return, she spoke of her own past, shedding the final layers of her guarded pride. She spoke of the utter humiliation of her betrayal, the terrifying, hollow feeling of standing in the dust of Oakhaven with nothing but the clothes on her back, believing that her intelligence and her worth meant absolutely nothing in a world ruled by predatory men. She confessed that she had expected to be broken by the harshness of the frontier, but that the quiet, steady rhythm of the ranch and his unwavering, silent respect had reforged her into something stronger. The exchange was not passionate or fiery. It was the quiet, fundamental fusing of two pieces of iron in the cooling aftermath of a forge. The dawn brought a harsh grey light and a cold, absolute resolve. The fire had been intended to destroy their livelihood and bury the evidence of Silas Thorne's crimes. Instead, it had galvanized them into an unbreakable unit. They washed the soot from their faces, bandaged their hands in silence, and dressed in their finest, most formal clothing. Lynn retrieved the canvas sack containing the ledgers, the heavy books now representing not just numbers, but the weapon with which they would reclaim their peace. They hitched the wagon and drove down the mountain toward Oakhaven, the air between them thrumming with a shared methodical purpose. They arrived in the town square just as the morning activity was reaching its peak. Silas Thorne was standing on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, holding court with a group of local merchants, looking smug and entirely self-satisfied, likely awaiting news of the devastating fire at the solitary ranch. His smug expression dissolved into a mask of pale shock as the buckboard wagon rolled into the center of the street and came to a halt. Elias stepped down, his presence commanding immediate, absolute silence from the gathered crowd. He turned and offered his hand to Lynn, assisting her down with a deliberate public show of deep respect. Together they walked up the wooden steps of the town courthouse, bypassing the Mercantile entirely. Elias called out for the local magistrate, a generally fair-minded man who had long suspected the banker's dealings but lacked the proof to act. The crowd, sensing a reckoning, swelled and pressed closer. Silas Thorne, realizing the danger, attempted to push his way through the throng, shouting desperately about slander and demanding the immediate arrest of the rancher and his vagrant accomplice. He was ignored. On the elevated steps of the courthouse, in the harsh, unforgiving light of the morning sun, Lynn opened the canvas sack. She did not raise her voice, but her clear, precise diction carried across the silent square. She presented the ledgers to the magistrate, opening them to the meticulously bookmarked pages. She explained, with devastating clarity, the exact mechanisms of the fraud, the inflated interest, the phantom charges, the forged signatures. She pointed out the mathematical impossibilities in the bank's own public records, using the antagonist's own poorly kept numbers as the rope to hang his reputation. Silas Thorne attempted to bluster, to deny, to claim the books were forged, but his voice cracked with cowardice. The crowd, many of whom recognized the same fraudulent patterns in their own dealings with the man, began to murmur angrily, the collective tide of public opinion turning swiftly and violently against him. The magistrate, reviewing the undeniable, crystalline logic of Lynn's accounting, ordered the immediate seizure of the bank's records and the detainment of Silas Thorne pending a federal investigation. The pillar of the community crumbled in an instant, his power broken by the quiet competence of the woman he had tried to destroy and the immovable integrity of the man who had stood beside her. The ride back to the ranch was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The crushing weight of the external threat had been lifted, leaving behind a profound, breathless sense of freedom. Elias drove the wagon, his posture relaxed, the deep lines of tension erased from his weathered face. Lynn sat beside him, the empty canvas sack resting in her lap, watching the familiar landscape unfold. As they crossed the boundary line onto their own land, the sound of the rushing creek welcoming them home, Elias pulled back on the reins, bringing the horses to a gentle halt beneath the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. He turned to her, resting his arm across the back of the wooden bench. The silence between them was rich, comfortable, and deeply understood. He did not offer a flowery declaration of love or a passionate, dramatic monologue. He was a man of the earth, and his words were grounded in the practical reality of the life they had built. He looked at her dark eyes, at the fine, strong lines of her face, and stated simply that the arrangement they had made months ago was no longer sufficient. He noted that a ranch could not be run on ledgers alone, and that a house was just timber and stone without a partner to share the quiet within it. He reached into his pocket, his hand lingering for a moment before he withdrew nothing. The pocket was empty. The handkerchief was gone, given away and never asked for in return. He looked at his empty hand, a rare, dry smile touching the corners of his mouth. He looked back at her and made his proposal. He asked her to stay, not as a bookkeeper, not as a housekeeper, but as a wife. He offered her an equal share of the land, an equal voice in the domain, and the absolute, unwavering devotion of a man who had finally remembered how to live. The proposal was a plain-spoken, heartfelt offer of lifelong partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger and earned respect. Lynn looked at the man who had offered her a lifeline when the world had offered only dust and malice. She thought of the fire, the ledgers, the quiet evenings by the lamp, and the profound safety she felt in his presence. She reached into the pocket of her own heavy skirt and withdrew the faded white cotton handkerchief, now washed clean of soot but permanently stained with a faint smoky shadow. She held it out, resting it upon his large calloused palm, and closed her fingers over his. She accepted his offer with a single affirmative nod, her voice steady and warm, as she stated that she found the terms of the new arrangement to be entirely acceptable. A year passed, the seasons turning with a predictable, comforting rhythm over the vast expanse of the territory. The time skip brought with it a profound demonstration of prosperity. The solitary ranch was solitary no more. The blackened scar near the barn where the fire had raged was gone, replaced by a newly constructed, expanded timber stable. The pastures were full of healthy, grazing cattle, the debts of the past completely eradicated by careful management and honest labour. Oakhaven, having purged itself of its predatory element, now viewed the couple with a deep, grudging respect that had slowly blossomed into genuine admiration. They were no longer the recluse and the outsider, they were the bedrock of the community. The most striking transformation, however, was the garden surrounding the stone house. Where there had once been a chaotic tangle of dead vines, there was now a flourishing, vibrant explosion of life. Lynn had cultivated neat, orderly rows of vegetables, heavy blooms of drought-resistant flowers, and climbing vines that softened the harsh stone of the porch. It was a tangible symbol of her inherent competence, her ability to bring order and beauty to a harsh environment, and a reflection of the life that had returned to Elias's soul. The ranch hummed with a quiet, steady energy, a testament to the power of their united front. The story concluded on a warm, late summer evening. The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold. Elias and Lynn sat side by side on the heavy wooden bench on the front porch, the day's labour finished. The ledgers were balanced, the livestock secured, the property thriving. He held a cup of dark coffee. She held a small basket of mending, though her hands were still. They looked out over the rolling land, the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the darkening grass. They sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of profound contentment. Elias thought of the day he had watched her standing in the dust, proud and unbroken, and marvelled at the sheer improbable fortune of his own intervention. Lynn thought of the heavy, soot-stained night, the smell of smoke, and the gentle touch of his calloused hands. They had faced the cruelty of the world and the ghosts of their pasts, and they had built a fortress of mutual respect and quiet love. The final image was one of absolute, earned peace, a thriving homestead, a shared future secured, and a silence that was no longer empty but filled with the unwavering certainty of their partnership.